with my JSON file in the context of .NET Core, right? This is all
I believe so. I don't actually know how context.
So I don't know what the policy is, but we've hardly used app context in .NET Core, right?
I think core it's like programmatically only, but I could be wrong.
You can put it in the JSON. I couldn't say how to do it, but you can because someone told me that. So maybe it's a static method as well.
Oh, you just like to have static switching.
Yeah. Especially if you're library, you know,
or like use exactly the same mechanism you're currently using to say that you start at deserialization.
I don't know what this policy is, but we've hardly used.
Well, I'm not sure those are directly related because, like, start deserialization.
I'm saying that they use the same mechanism to kind of signal, hey, because like currently, like when you start deserialization, you kind of are able to tell, hey, this is the code path which is doing something bad, right? So you can use the same mechanism. Hey, this is the code path I want to prevent this security feature.
So you could do, okay, so I think we're describing two separate things here to make this sound right. So one possibility is that we put a static method somewhere that says turn on or turn off serialization guard or a property for it or something. And then, so then anybody in the process can make that decision for the process. Christoph, the thing that you're describing, it sounds like would be more like we put like an overload on binary formatter.deserialize that says, would you like to have or not have serialization guard right now? Yes, we could conceivably do either of those things.
Who do we want to be able to make the decision? Do we want people to be forced to make it everywhere that we serialize? Do we want people to decide this entire app and all of its friends that it talks to are completely trusted?
Right. So the sort of suggestion, the sort of idea would be that we would actually like this on by default for Core 3. That's a different decision for framework, but for Core 3, it seems like it ought to be reasonably compatible and helpful on the security side. So we want to be able to say, okay, I want to not have this.
I currently like kind of don't see like any why would you ever want any of these gadgets? Like
it gets more complicated on desktop when you get remoting involved and stuff. We don't have that problem.
Yeah, like on desktop, I can kind of see like someone can be broken, but like on core, I cannot like even think of any scenario where you actually want this.
Yeah, let's not talk about the policy whether it's on or off because it's almost orthogonal to the APIs, right? Like if it's on, like there's some API shit you have to interact with. If it's off, then it's off. But like it's the same APIs, right?
Well, but whether it's forced on and always on, that is reflecting the APIs because we need to have a way to switch it off.
Right.
But it sounds
sure,
like
you might need an API to turn it off, but I would say like let's table that for like until we know what the policy is, right? But I think in general, like if you accept the feature to be on, I think we should be able to make progress on the rest because we only have 25 minutes left, and I think policy decisions take usually longer than that.
Right.
So the deserialization blocked exception I think is fine. The only thing I would suggest is like is binary formatter the only serializer we would tackle that is shipping inbox, or is there any others that we would tackle inbox? Because it seems weird to use the binary format as exception, because then you're compatible there, but you're not compatible anywhere else. And that's what is derived from exception, and say this is not for binary formatter; it's for every DSerializer that wants to opt into that feature.
So the ones I'm doing on desktop currently are binary formatter, net data contract serializer, and SOAP formatter. I'm almost certain SOAP formatter isn't on core. I'm checking net data contract serializer.
Don't think it is.
So we do have net DCS. Oh wait, no, we don't. Docs just does interesting redirection tricks. So we maybe don't have net DCS on core.
There's XML deserializer, right?
I'm sorry?
There's XML deserializer, but I am not sure.
Right. So in the sort of initial version of this, I don't think we are going to have it in XML serializer or data contract formatter. There's sort of a case for doing it eventually, perhaps.
You need data context serializer, DCS.
Yeah.
Is DCS considered benign so far as no one's found the gadget yet?
So the deal with XML serializer and data contract serializer is that they accept a list of types that the developer wants to deserialize, and so for the most part that's fine. There have been finds of some application will not really feel like making that list, so they'll actually accept the list also from an attacker and be exploitable that way. So there's for anyone interested in digging into this, there was a good talk at Black Hat a couple years back called Friday the 13th JSON and JSON attacks that sort of outlines this. So it's certainly not a prevalent problem. You can follow good and even reasonably sensible practices and be fine on data contract format.
And for arbitrary serializers that people have just made up themselves with similar problems, there's nothing stopping them implementing this once we put it out there.
From like using the API, yeah. If they, they would actually kind of have to use the API in order to do it. They can't really stop you from starting a process without being able to go change process. Yeah. I did reach out to James Newton King, and he had questions. Of course, I still have to get back to him on the questions. So that's not a yes and it's not a no.
I'm just saying it would be easy for us to accidentally make it impossible for external people to imbue their own serializer, right? We want to avoid.
So why would we make it accidentally impossible for you?
Well, I'm just saying if we're focusing on implementing this for binary format in CCS.
Sure.
If we expose this, is there any concern about this itself being used to cause problems? Like, if someone was able to execute code and call start deserialization, then basically you'd never be able to use process and file and whatever else for the remainder of the process.
You actually covered that during the code. You raised these questions, and
this maybe sounds like a different question.
No, I think that's what you meant, that you can start the deserialization and then actually somehow get out of that code path and basically the processing state that it thinks it's always deserializing.
Yeah. So I mean, what I'll say is the sort of general threat model here is that code in an ASP.NET or in a .NET Core of any sort app is trusted code. So I wouldn't expect that someone sort of is expected to have enough code execution to call start deserialization without otherwise being well outside of the security boundaries.
So is start deserialization itself a target that uses whatever that other API is, throw on dangerous deserialization?
I mean, sort of as an implementation detail, it kind of turns out not to be. But certainly, given the implementation could change.
It's no different to 10,000 other APIs that I could just shaft my process. Like, if I can edit the environment block, I can either make process start not work most of the time, or make it launch my own exe or God knows what. So
yeah, I think basically the idea would be if you can call this method, you can already run code in the process, right? Which at this point you already fucked.
The whole purpose of this feature is you're able to run code in the process. Let's stop you from doing certain things. And I'm suggesting, isn't this one of those things we need to stop you from doing?
I see. One thing we may have to address from a practical standpoint on start deserialization is that deserialization can be and actually is sometimes recursive. For example, I think a data set will, in its deserialization, will new up a new binary formatter and deserialize. So we actually have to be capable of handling recursive deserialization. Now, it is true that if you were to just sort of leak your serialization state, so all of this is sort of locked to your thread and async context. So you've messed up this thread and async context, but you haven't messed up the whole process.
Do we have on framework we had this attribute we could put on methods that would block them or would either allow or block the API from being callable from reflection? I forgot what it was.
So I mean, there were lots of things you could do with CAS, and then there's some kind of reflection blocking attribute that only kind of works, but I don't remember the exact details.
Because I mean, really, realistically, the threat is that you call this API via reflection, right?
Right.
Yeah. I'm not sure how that's different calling any other API, right? The key thing we want to block is not random code methods that could do bad things, but things that we can find a way could be triggered through deserialization. Like they're part of the implementation, deserializing some type that's actually serialized.
Sure, but I think the problem here is like calling start deserialization indirectly when the other party basically authored it correctly and had a using block around it is not as problematic as if you call the API directly, leak effectively the deserialization token, and now disable effectively half your APIs in the framework until the the finalizer ran over that, right?
That's not a hostile situation. That's a mistake, right? Yeah. I mean,
No, I'm saying like if you're doing deserialization, find a way to call this method yourself,
right.
And then you basically like purposefully leak the token.
Right.
Which now means you disable deserialization basically for everybody.
I guess what I'm trying to understand in my head, and maybe I'm missing, is if you can call this method, why can't you call the first start?
Well, I mean, that's Stephen's point, right? Like, Stephen's point was basically this whole feature is about people can run arbitrary or virtually arbitrary code in your process. We try to.
It's not about preventing arbitrary. This is about before you get to the arbitrary code. It's in the deserialization that we prevent you even getting there, right?
Well, okay, so let me talk about this in a couple of ways. So one is sort of the gadget target distinction. You're sort of nodding to it a little bit, which is, so gadgets are the ways that we know that you can do bad things, and so we just don't let you do those. And that's sort of what you're describing. Then you just don't get anywhere if you try to use a known gadget.
Right.
But the reason that we have this concept of targets is under the assumption that, number one, there might be unknown gadgets. And number two, even if we do a perfect job, there may well be gadgets in upstack code or in third-party code. And so it may still be possible to get some amount of control. And then someone may still want to parlay that into starting a process or loading an assembly or something like that. And so that's the reason we put the blocks in those things. Yeah.
I see. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So sort of under that threat model, yes, you could perhaps describe start deserialization as a target. So the threat there would be denial of service. I will say that in particular with binary format, this isn't necessarily true of other serializers, that there are other denial of services, and this is a remote code execution mitigation, but not a denial of service mitigation. So that would sort of be a limited denial of service on just sort of, you have this one thread that can't start processes anymore. But I also, like, short of trying to do some kind of reflection prevention, I don't see how we could tell the difference between this is a necessary recursive call like data set,
right,
versus this is being treated as a target for denial of service.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the only differentiation that I can think of is if you could determine that you were directly called by a reflection, because that's really the only thing. I mean, because if you're indirectly called, then, well, that's probably normal deserialization. If you're directly called by somebody, then that seems bad. Like, why would you do that? But I think that was I forgot what it was. I think we did it for Windows 8 when we attributed public APIs that were in the Windows 8 API set as, you can call them by reflection. All the ones that didn't have that were not called by reflection, even when they were public.
Yeah, so that thing was actually special built into framework for like Windows 8 apps.
So I don't think we had this as a general mechanism. So, but I think that would be, if we would have it, it would probably be the right thing to do.
Yeah, it would have actually simplified a lot of the implementation of this.
Well, nice, and it would have to identify being directly called, as you say. Like, reflection could be way up the stack above where the serialization even started.
I mean, basically, the way we did that for Windows 8 was reflection had knowledge of these things it wasn't supposed to do, and so it would stop you. So that might be a nice core feature, but we don't have it right now.
Is reflection invoke itself a target, or is that used actually during deserialization, and so we couldn't disable it?
Well, it certainly is during deserialization, but I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a target because it would just be sort of another way to get to a method that, like, it still had. The way I would think of targets is a target is your actual goal. Like, why is it that you're building this payload? It's because you want to run your malware. So how do you run your malware? You do it by loading an assembly or something, but not by invoke.
I probably meant gadget, not target.
Oh, it's not a gadget in that there's the serializers won't sort of I mean, they will use it directly as part of the implementation, but it's not sort of an attacker-controlled thing that is being deserialized. So a gadget would typically be a serializable object or a property or constructor or something like that on something that sort of goes off and does work on its own that ends up being attacker-controlled.
Right. I guess I'm wondering, like, something like the temp.io collection, right? The concern there is it deletes an arbitrary file.
Right.
There must be, there's probably some type somewhere in the world that on deserialization takes a string and invokes it. That would be considered a target, right?
Yes, exactly. That type would be a target. I'm sorry, that type would be a gadget.
Sorry, that type would be a gadget, but the reflection invoke in that case would be a target.
I would think of the reflection invoke as just sort of how the gadget works, if that makes any sense.
Well, okay, maybe I don't understand the concept then, because to me that's the same as process starter file dot write. It's how the gadget works, and yet we're talking about those as targets.
So I guess what I'm sort of trying to describe is, how do I put this? Like a gadget is a type that on deserialization goes and triggers something that's attacker controlled that gives you more control of the process. Not necessarily full control of the process, but more control of the process than you had before.
Right, so the gadget would be Steve's terrible type that on deserialization takes a string from serialization info and does something with it. Right. And to me that would be does something with it is file.open that path, process.start that path, reflection.invoke that path.
Is it just semantics? Does it affect the API or?
What target?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going. Sorry, I was just saying it doesn't affect the API per se, but it affects all the various things we consider to be targets.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean that. Well, so first of all, I do expect the list to change over time. So even if I say the wrong thing today, that'll be something that we can correct for as experience with this and research continues. And there's certainly also a practical aspect of this, which is that, like, reflection is everywhere, and certainly in deserialization there's reflection everywhere, so it's sort of not practical to block it. But like I'm trying to look quickly at activity surrogate selector is an example of a framework gadget. I'm pretty sure we just don't have it on core. So the point of activity surrogate selector is it uses reflection, but what it uses reflection to do is it will create an object of any type for you and fill its fields in. And it does that via reflection, but that's sort of, you can look at it as sort of a whole as that's the gadget, but doing that isn't malware. It's not, some sort of nefarious end in and of itself. Whereas once you get to assembly load, that's saying, okay, well, here's my malware, start it up.
Is there much more below this?
No, there's just exception type.
So, what's the right thing to do to decide the policy, right? Because, I mean, normally the way API reviews seem to work is we walk out of here having marked it approved, and then anyone can, there's like an implication that it's ready to, you can just implement it or go in the next release.
Yeah, before we go there, so we talked about start deserialization. Deserialization in progress, I think we're okay with the name. This one we said we want a different name, right?
Or unblocked deserialization.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Or maybe just throw block deserialization, right? Like internally, we have like throw invalid operation exception root.
Right.
Yeah, except the idea is here that there's an if check in that method. It doesn't always throw, right?
Of course, yeah.
Maybe throw if blocked deserialization.
Yeah. Jeremy raised a question.
I'm sorry, just finish my thought. What about check for block deserialization, right? Because the fact that it throws is arguably an implementation thing. It could terminate the process.
Not really, because I mean, like, you want to be able to handle the potentially the exception on the call side, right?
Right.
And I think this ends up being a convenience thing. If someone wanted to determine, all this thing does, it's a one-liner, right? It's if deserialization progress, throw new dangerous deserialization exception.
Right.
If someone wanted to fail fast, they could do if deserialization in progress environment.failfast.
Exactly.
Right. I ended up writing the convenience method because when I had to fill in a bunch of targets, I was writing that same block over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
Although I suppose we could also talk quickly about, so there's a little bit of difference between audience on start deserialization and then the second two. So the first one is you're a serializer, the second two is you're a gadget or a target. And so if we don't think it would be interesting to have something available for third-party gadgets or targets, which I don't have as strong of a case for, we could also have those.
So what do you want to expose?
Well, exposing start deserialization means that a serializer can say, hey, please engage all of this machinery. Deserialization in progress and throw on dangerous deserialization are for gadgets and targets to say, get me out of here.
Right.
So making it a public API means that if there were a third-party gadget or target that wanted to protect itself, it could, but I don't have a strong case for that. I don't have the thing to point to for that.
Sorry, I don't remember this in your design, but are the situations in which deserialization in progress would return true and I would choose not to throw? Like, I'm assuming it's something like check my process start is actually one of these three things I think is really safe. I don't know.
One thing that I could imagine being guarded with this is Roslyn, right? Like, what is the chances that you want to compile and run C# code on the fly during deserialization, right? That should be
you could imagine.
Fairly straightforward. Right?
Presumably as well, like in process stuff, like you talked about the whole feature gets turned on and then there are compat flags or quirks to turn off individual things. So presumably in process.start, it won't use throw on dangerous deserialization. It'll say if deserialization in progress and process flag is still true, then throw.
What's the process flag?
Oh, I think the way, like an app context flag for specific to should we start processes.
Ah, right.
Yeah. So I think what I did for those kinds of things was if this app context flag is set, then call throw on dangerous deserialization exception. It's obviously not that big of a difference by the time you already have the if block, though.
What did we decide on the throw? Because I'm thinking now, just thinking about the two, it makes sense for it to be throw deserialization on progress. Is that what we decided?
So what I have wrote down is throw deserialization in progress.
Right. I would love it if those two names were the same, except one began with throw.
Right.
If.
That's basically what I have. I have throw if deserialization in progress.
Perfect. Then it's obvious what it is.
And then I think the only thing I could imagine is that we add a string argument for a switch or something, right? So that you don't have to do that.
Yeah, we could do that. If it takes a string argument, that will hurt perf a little bit.
Right.
Because app context switches are actually cached, so they're just like check a static bool. So the taking a string would mean it has to go like to a dictionary lookup or something like that.
Well, I think that's one of those things that we need to make sure. I think when we actually make a granular in core and see like how do individual things check for their app compat switches, right? We need to figure out.
I mean, to be clear, the implementation is all but done in desktop at this point. As in, we've done all of that stuff. It's just like polishing off a couple of really tiny things. So this is based off of having built all of this in desktop.
Are you going to go back? So that's checked in before 8 or about 2, or you're just going to tune the API?
We're working on the checking mechanics, but yeah, it's good to go on however it is we get it into.
So like unrelated question: does this deserialization token need the explicit private constructor? So just to make sure, I'm over like if the public constructor wasn't like default or something.
I mean, the class has an internal constructor, but it's not in the API. It's internal.
No, I'm saying like if you don't say anything, will it be public?
If you don't type anything into C#, yes, but are you saying like when I go to check in a contract for this, do I have to write something?
You have to write internal.
I have to write internal. Okay.
Just not forget.
Okay. Yeah. Good to know. Jeremy also raised the sort of reasonable question of should deserialization token actually be a public type, or should start deserialization just return an iDisposable? I wasn't sure what the guideline would be.
So the only reason why having a different type would be useful is if you want to avoid the allocation, you just make it a struct.
Which I don't really want to do because basically the existence of these things is what keeps is what's allowed to turn deserialization back off. And so if you end up with sort of multiple copies of the struct and you dispose them separately, then you.
Well, it depends on what the structs are
state.
holding, right? When I looked at the implementation of Jeremy, it looked like the only thing that the struct holds is a reference to managed object,
Yeah.
which you then call during dispose. So even if you copy the struct around, like the underlying object can only be disposed once. So like there's no copying of
state. The underlying object doesn't get disposed. The underlying object is actually where the sort of state for the thread is.
Sure, but my point is like if you do it multiple times, like you don't have there's no boolean in the deserialization.
This is all predicated on you want to avoid an allocation, and binding deserialization is a machine for making lots of objects really fast. So I don't think.
I was just going to say that.
I'm sorry. Yeah, like, I think if you just have to make one object before you call the object creating machine, it doesn't seem like a lot.
That's fair. I mean, like that's the thing. I mean, I just think you could do it if you want.
For binary formatter, that's true. But imagine that there was a feature added to UTF-8 JSON reader or something, JSON deserializer, where this was needed. That would be an extra allocation in a case where maybe we can't afford it.
Isn't that serializer also supposed to create objects, though?
I mean, not necessarily. Imagine the whole payload is a bunch of structs.
And it can actually do that without allocation? That's a cool trick. Okay. Where of that? I can.
I mean, it depends on how you do it,
think
right?
about what exactly the copy semantics end up being for this.
Well, like the way, like the class you showed me literally only had one field.
Yeah.
And it's an object reference. That seems fine in a struct. Like there's no shadowing, there's no copying of
I
state.
get that. It's more about just, yeah, what exactly happens when you double dispose this and like.
Well, double dispose needs to be
else?
fine.
Yes,
by
I suppose
guidelines.
that's true.
So you should be able to do that.
Yeah. Or I mean, not just double dispose though. Like it will.
But
I just want to go check my implementation.
Isn't like calling dot dispose like causing the boxing anyway, or is it like is there some like hack in the?
No, if you know
the
that
compiler
it's a struct, it
does the
won't
right
be
thing.
fast.
I think my feedback would be if this object is actually storing meaningful state, like whether it's been disposed or not, and that can't be pushed down into other objects it's creating, then it makes sense to just get rid of the type and return idisposable. Okay. If all this ends up being is a wrapper for some other reference type, and this dispose is just calling that dispose, and there's nothing else that the guy is doing, then having it be a public struct is probably better.
Okay.
All right, that seems fine. Anything else regarding the API shape?
Does the exception need a string inner exception constructor? I guess I'm not sure when these constructors are used, but generally the guidance for exceptions is they have a parameterless, one with a message and one with a message and inner exception. Obviously, this one's already special because it's not taking a message; it's taking a switch name.
Yeah, that's the other thing that's somewhat unfortunate, right? It's this whole argument exception. I forgot which one it is, but one of them has the message and the argument at the parameter name swapped, which always trips me off.
Yeah, I mean, if there's guidance on a different way to do this, that's fine. The idea with the switch name one is just simply I have a different string that says if you don't want to throw out of process, then use the process switch.
Right. I guess. Yeah, inner exception seems odd. Like you shouldn't have one, right?
I'm wondering if that would just be like if we just did the normal thing, parameterless message exception. You can pass whatever message you want, including the switch name.
Right.
Okay, and then just make the caller responsible for coming up with the string.
If we use the helper, they would use if deserialization in progress.
Yeah, like
do whatever.
Would there be any objection to having a factory for that? I'm just thinking about managing that string and kind of needing it in a bunch of places.
Well, I mean, what would be wrong with just literally having the helper method? Like, why would you ever fabricate the exception without throwing?
I'm a little confused.
Like, we have this helper, like, throw of deserialization in progress, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you want to fabricate the exception with the predetermined string, you just call that one. Why would you ever just fabricate the exception and not throw? Or not doing the
so
checks?
I have two strings. One is the just sort of generic string, and one is a string that has somewhere to insert a switch name in it.
Yeah, I would expect that, as I was saying, like, I mean, if we support granular checking, I would expect we would have a throw helper with the ability to check for that as well.
Okay.
And then we would have an overload to throw if progress that actually allows you to pass the string or whatever the representation of the switch is, and then that guy fabricates the right string.
Okay, that's reasonable.
What is the exception serialized? I'm just kind of curious.
Because they all are.
Canonical example is you do remoting and you want to travel the error on the other side or between app domains. So basically all exceptions are serializable.
It doesn't contain anything.
Yeah. Probably all the default patterns for the switch, the construction of the message with the switch name. Can be Are we okay with the type where we added on? I think serialization info as the primary container seems sensible to me, although that's again like binary formatter specific, but I don't think anybody really cares. Seems odd to use a new type.
Okay, cool.
All right, then I think so. I don't know how to best track this. What I would probably do is I would just publish the notes and I say, so what's missing or what remains to be done is remaining work. Agree on default policy on off. Provide row helper with switch.
Sorry, just back to your previous question. One other thought would be their system runtime serialization formatter services. I realize formatter is, a different name than serializer, but it also seems like a reasonable landing place. I don't care.
Yeah, let me see where that has and.
That one is equally though.
Yeah, no, they're both tied to binary formatter in a way. So it's just another option of a landing place for a bunch of static helpers.
It's true.
Yeah, I mean neither of them is.
But formatter is only for the direction where you serialize, right? It's not for the deserialization per se, right? But I guess that's can be said about the class code serialization.
It also has stuff for deserialization because it has, for example, get uninitialized object.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
And then one other thing that I'd want to double check that I just don't know off the top is how the layering worked out for that in core. So since I have to be able to call these things from a lot of places, I'm hoping for something in corelib or otherwise pretty far down.
Yeah, that's a good point. Serialization
so we can
info
check
already...
where formatter services is.
Yeah, serialization info I think is in corelib.
It is, yes.
And because that has to be used by every freaking exception, and then formatter service is probably where the binary formatter is. No, it's actually in system runtime serialization formatters.
Well, we've got a little bit of a weird setup. We've got an internal implementation in CoreLib that's then exposed with on runtime helpers, and then the formatter services in CoreFX calls that thing. So it's a little bit of a hack.
Yeah, the CoreLib one actually isn't the full class. It just has get uninitialized object. So
Right.
the public class must be up in CoreFX somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would mean that for internal purposes we have it effectively in caller, but for public API purposes we wouldn't have that, right? So we would have to. So in that sense, if you want to make this public, it probably is better off on serialization info because it's already in system runtime.
It's probably true. Assuming we don't want to make a new type, which I think is a reasonable thing to declare.
Yeah, I would say that too. Like serialization is not the area that needs more types. All right, so then I think that was it. So provide the variable with switch, agree on default policy, and then agree on whether or not we make these APIs public in .NET Core 3.0.
For that part, I'd love it if we could have some customers that are actually sort of on board to use them, and if we do, great, let's make them public.
Right.
But so we should, I think we should attack it from that perspective.
Yeah. So you said you already have the PR in progress for the full framework implementation. How did you pass the switches there? Or do you not have a granular opt-in, opt-out mechanism yet?
No, I did build that. So they are app context switches on full framework, in part because we can't do API work there.
And I guess you don't call the throw helper because you cannot call the API anyway, right?
I mean, I do call the throw helper. I just, like, on full framework, I can't make things public, so I have to use reflection internally, but
right.
I still use it.
So you have literally a throw helper that takes a string? Is that how you do
Oh, I see what you're saying. I have, this is the API that I have internally right now there. So it, like, if you want to throw with the other string, oh, I see what you're saying. That was actually one of the things that I hadn't dealt with was, like, the upstack thing that had to call by a reflection. But where I wasn't using reflection, I was just newing up the exception type and not using the helper.
I see. You basically know you basically know what feature you are, so you check the corresponding app context switch, and that if that is set or not set, depending on mechanics you throw or you don't throw.
Yeah.
That makes sense. All right, so then, okay, so that seems pretty straightforward then. Yeah, I think the only thing we should probably start with the implementation level work on CoreFX, and then, like, in parallel, continue the conversation you started with James, because he's probably the first one where it would make sense.
Yeah, the one thing that he sort of expressed in terms of reservations, again, early in the conversation, was it's not available on all of the things that he targets, so that might also be an adoption blocker for him, which makes sense.
Yeah, although, like, in his case, like, the way he's done with this problem, they've dealt with this in the past, is he calls everything by reflection, right? Like, I mean, he, like, for example, he can handle all the immutable collection types we have, and he just discovers them by, or it's this type name, this one, and then, okay, I call this method over there that I know exists, and like, it's probably not going to help the performance, but at the same time, you can cache a bunch of stuff, and, like, the other interesting thing is that I don't, as you said, like in JSON, I think the only case where that would matter is basically the one when you actually have type information, right? Everything else wouldn't matter, right?
Not too much.
So I think that's the other question. Like, are we aware of any other serializer that has basically type identity baked into the payload?
Yes, there are third-party serializers that do that. I don't recall any of the names off the top, but that same Friday the 13th presentation has a very nice table of various serializers and exactly what problems they do and don't have in this area. Including both Microsoft and outside serializers.
Okay. I guess Jeremy has the list as well, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I think that's a decent set of next steps. So then I will consider this approve the feedback with the caveat that we have to figure out, like, when and how, right? But that seems fine. All right, then if there are more questions, let me check whether anybody had questions on mine, but doesn't sound like it. We were running without audio for 20 minutes because apparently when I set it up, I did not pair my audio source, so we only have audio for the last 40 minutes at this point. All right, then I call it a day, and then I see you guys next Tuesday.
Okay.
Thanks all.